Hello and welcome to the third session of the Think Big Virtual Forum. I'm Peter Henderson from Reuters News and I'm your moderator. Today we're going to be thinking about a cleaner, greener economic recovery and how impact assessment can help with a focus on ecocentric thinking and thinking about climate change. It's brought to you by the International Association for Impact Assessment and the Earth Law Center. Today we're going to hear first from Stacy Finneran. She's an assistant professor of professional practice in environmental assessment at Ohio State University. She also runs the master's program in environment and natural resources there. She's going to talk to us about innovative approaches to sustainable human livelihoods and biodiversity conservation with a focus on impact assessment. Let's listen.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. In keeping with the theme of this webinar series, I would like to contribute my thoughts about the role impact assessment is very well suited to play in facilitating an upscaling of a more ecocentric approach for achieving sustainable human livelihoods and well-being and biodiversity conservation. This is exactly what is needed across several areas of practice, and I would like to share with you a few initiatives that are underway and that I'm involved with to demonstrate the possibilities for a future direction for impact assessment. As you can see from the brief bio about me, I'm currently a professional practice professor at The Ohio State University, specializing in environmental assessment. I also direct a professional master's program and a graduate environmental assessment certificate program and teach 2 courses that focus on environmental assessment, as practiced within the U.S. and as practiced by various countries and institutions around the world. So you can see that environmental assessment takes up a lot of my thought space, and that is fundamentally because I believe in its foundational principles. I think that they are fit for purpose to help address some of our most pressing challenges. So you could say I'm a believer. My disciplinary background is a BS in civil engineering with professional consulting experience and also some expert witness work for environmental litigation. My graduate work was as an ecologist specializing in wetland forested systems, looking at long-term change. And then finally, as it relates to what I will share with you today, I am a commission member with the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, within the Commission on Ecosystem Management, working in the area of nature-based solutions with a focus on ecosystem-based adaptation for climate change adaptation, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, and most recently working with nature-based solutions in a humanitarian context. This work on the humanitarian work, as the other work with ecosystem-based adaptation and ecosystem disaster risk reduction, of course, involves a collaboration with international partners. And so for the humanitarian work, the idea is to help frontline humanitarian workers deal with the changing and I would say alarming circumstances surrounding an increasing number of people on the move. And how do we more effectively engage with the ecosystems in which these displaced populations find themselves for their safety, their security, and human well-being, and also to safeguard the ecosystem function that underpins their well-being. So in this brief presentation, I will attempt to connect these various initiatives that are being upscaled to meet the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis to the potential role that impact assessment could play, the increasing role that it could play, both to achieve these objectives and to take a more, to help facilitate a more ecocentric approach. So fundamentally, and what the title of my talk indicates is what I see as a core idea within the practice of an innovative form of impact assessment called vulnerability and impact assessment, specifically as it is used to inform nature-based solutions, such as ecosystem-based adaptation, meaning to support climate adaptation projects. So I'd like to share a little about these topics with you. briefly, as context to the issue under discussion, as we know, we face twin interconnected challenges: the climate change crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And now we face these twin challenges while grappling with COVID-19 recovery. And we are also very concerned about how we might create change to avoid the next pandemic. Fortunately, we have seen an incredible build-out of nature-based solutions, standards, criteria, and related platforms supported by collaborations and funding mechanisms that have resulted in a growing number of ecosystem-based adaptation projects occurring around the world. In fact, there has been such a great uptake of the idea of nature-based solution approaches within the international community. Concern has now turned to how can we upscale these projects fast enough to keep up with the accelerating pace of climate change effects, including related disasters. This is a good first step for transitioning to a more ecocentric approach for projects. I will explain why. And please note this work was already well underway before COVID-19 hit. So a firm foundation has been established for this work by the effort of some incredibly capable people, a very good sign. First, I would like to take just a minute to define some of these terms for what I'm sharing, for those of you who may not be familiar with them. So as you can see on this slide, I'm providing a definition for the nature-based solutions, and this is taken from the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management's webpage, as well as this graphic to give you a feel for what's involved with nature-based solutions. So, nature-based solutions are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So I think you can see quite clearly from this definition how it fits quite well with the topic, the theme of this webinar, and also of this session topic. There are several forms of nature-based solutions, and in fact the term was created to provide an umbrella concept to capture the many approaches that have been developed over the last few, I would say, decades really, to try to bring a more ecocentric, or perhaps we could also say ecologically sound methods for addressing environmental problems related to the socio-ecological environment. For example, some of these, as you can see represented on this slide, here is a list, again, taken from the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management website, a list of the various types of approaches that fall under the umbrella of nature-based solutions approaches. And I've highlighted the one that I'll focus on for our talk today, and that is ecosystem-based adaptation, which focuses on climate change. And as you can see on this slide, I'm providing a definition for ecosystem-based adaptation, which, as I said, is a type of nature-based solution, one that is specifically designed to harness biodiversity and ecosystem services to increase resilience and reduce the vulnerability of human communities and natural systems to climate change. Diving a little more deeply into the vulnerability and impact assessment method as it's used to inform ecosystem-based adaptation projects, I'll refer here to a guidance document that was put out by the United Nations Environment Program in 2015 called Guidance on Integrating Ecosystem Considerations into Climate Change Vulnerability and Impact Assessment to Inform Ecosystem-Based Adaptation. So this methodology provides a more bottom-up approach, which I think provides a great advantage for the approach, meaning that it has this engagement and consideration of a community level and ecosystem level details and dynamics as well as hopefully empowerment and voice. So this is an excellent resource to learn more about this methodology. And what I want to draw your attention to, and which I've attempted to demonstrate on this slide, is that within the 6 steps of performing vulnerability and impact assessment that's represented in the middle figure, there is in step 2 represented a core idea or paradigm, if you will, central to this form of vulnerability and impact assessment as a methodology, as well as similar approaches that incorporate this paradigm. So what we see here, and you can see in the green square, is this idea of that in order to have sustainable human livelihood and well-being, we must recognize that humans depend upon the ecosystem services that highly functioning, healthy ecosystems can provide. The biodiversity crisis and climate change itself are manifestations of humans failing to organize ourselves in a way that respects these linkages within the complex ecological system that is the Earth. These are just simply biological, ecological facts of the Earth, what it is, and how it functions. So our failure to understand and respect and incorporate what one could call an ecocentric view, but I would say it's just ecology, and in many respects that it's recognizing reality. So this failure in human thinking, it must change. It must be that we think big and that we think in an informed way about how our planet functions as an ecological system. We must elevate this informed way of thinking to levels of power that affect decision-making, specifically the decision-making of our most wealthy and our most powerful. This paradigm of the linkage between ecosystem health, ecosystem services, and human well-being, human livelihood, must be in the thinking of those who determine the direction of future financial investments, business models for major corporations, how they manage and determine their supply chains, the actions that insurance and the reinsurance industry take to reduce their risk. This paradigm must also inform the thinking and decision-making of our political leadership across all levels of government, whether it's supranational, national, regional, municipal, and community-based governance structures. It does little good to encourage people to drive electric cars or to choose mass transit fueled by renewable solar energy if these systems are not built and made available and made affordable for people to choose. And I think you know that impact assessment has an important role to play in delivering this informed way of thinking to our decision makers, both across the private and public sectors, to build out full private and public sector engagement. Impact assessment, as an impact assessment community, we do have more than 50 years of experience delivering the power of impact assessment to planning. So perhaps we as a community can design and promote innovative approaches to impact assessment to create these linkages between the different types of impact assessment that operate at different hierarchical levels to better integrate the need for overarching climate action goals and biodiversity targets within with the needs of communities and ecosystems. We see from systems thinking principles, such as those quoted here from Donella Meadows' book, Thinking in Systems, that the 3 characteristics of a highly functioning system are resilience, self-organization, and hierarchy. We hear a lot about the need for resilience in the face of climate change, which is certainly true and sound thinking from a systems perspective. But I think we also need to consider that it's methodologies like vulnerability and impact assessment that also allow us to consider ways in which we can provide communities and ecosystems with what they need to self-organize, or in other words, give them options and choices to change how they live in the face of climate change. This is a very powerful thing, to empower both human communities to self-organize through choice, and similarly to empower, if you will, ecosystems to self-organize and adapt, again through choice, which in the world of natural ecosystems is delivered by safeguarding biodiversity. It is biodiversity from which their ability to adapt arises. Ecosystems need options so they can adapt to this changing climate. That is the ability to self-organize. So with respect to hierarchy for highly functioning systems, what do I mean? I mentioned previously on the previous slide, what do I mean by connecting different types of impact assessment across hierarchical levels? I mean that we should seek to create procedures, methodologies, platforms that connect the power of strategic planning, such as that provided by strategic environmental assessment as a top-down approach, to the power of a more community-based, ecosystems-based approach, such as that captured by vulnerability and impact assessment, so that we can have the benefits of both. Viewed from a systems thinking lens, this is captured in the wisdom of a quote from the Thinking in Systems book I reference on this slide. To be a highly functional system, hierarchy must balance the welfare, freedoms, and responsibilities of the subsystem and total system. There must be enough central control to achieve coordination towards the large system goals and enough autonomy to keep all systems flourishing, functioning, and self-organizing. So when we apply that to our strategic environmental assessment, if that is a type of impact assessment that is used to help inform planning to support national adaptation plans, national determined contributions to address climate change, there's power in that level of analysis. But we also want to stretch across the hierarchies and make connections from those outcomes from strategic environmental assessment planning at that top-down level of approach to the more bottom-up, community-based, ecosystem-based information and planning that results from vulnerability and impact assessment, where we can develop strategies, we can identify needs and ways to adapt, as perhaps captured by indicators. So we need both of these forms of seemingly separate hierarchical levels of analysis to be connected, to be linked and aligned with each other, so that the overarching system goals captured in, again, the national adaptation plans or nationally determined contributions, or by sectoral planning using strategic environmental assessment, align with the adaptation projects such as ecosystem-based adaptation that can be developed and informed by the impact assessment methodology of vulnerability and impact assessment. We need these two forms of impact assessment to be in sync, to support and inform each other. Finally, impact assessment methods are well suited to assist with the uptake of nature-based solutions to inform action and decision-making in a humanitarian context. Impact assessment methods, such as those used in vulnerability and impact assessment practice, could be adapted to effectively engage with existing and perhaps newly created humanitarian standards of practice to facilitate the use of nature-based solution approaches, such as ecosystem-based adaptation for climate change adaptation and ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction for reducing disaster risk in a humanitarian context. Highlighted on this slide are two of the key messages provided in the Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation and Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction document discussing nature-based solutions in humanitarian contexts. The first key message I would like to share is that we see that the environmental dimensions of emergencies and humanitarian operations themselves can damage the environment and contribute to ecosystem degradation, such as through deforestation and unsustainable use of water and land resources. This in turn can further increase risk and exacerbate the vulnerability of local people. This is also the case when humanitarian crises, internally displaced persons, and refugee camps evolve into multi-generational communities that struggle with environmental degradation and exposure to related shocks and stresses. The degradation of ecosystems and their goods and services exacerbate exposure and vulnerability of people to these natural hazards, climate change impacts, and emergent novel zoonotic diseases such as COVID-19. The second key message, and the one that I think allows us to envision how we might create change, is that nature-based solutions can reduce vulnerability and increase the resilience of communities, reduce the likelihood impact of natural hazards, and reduce exposure to natural hazard events. Nature-based solutions can contribute to the humanitarian imperative of preventing and alleviating human suffering arising out of disasters and conflicts. Perhaps impact assessment can play a role in supporting our humanitarian workers to help them develop alternatives and options to better connect with the science behind ecosystem function in those places where displaced persons find themselves, and to understand the communities, the people, their culture, their needs, how they're going to achieve safety, security, livelihood for their well-being in these contexts. Although this can seem like a very overwhelming time with so many large challenges, I think it is also an exciting time for the impact assessment community in that we have a lot to offer. And so I encourage all of us to think about how we can create transformational change, to think big as an impact assessment professional community. Thank you for your attention as I share these ideas, and I look forward to hearing your ideas soon.
Thanks, Stacy. Next, we're going to hear from Grant Wilson, who is Executive Director of the Earth Law Center. Grant's an advocate for the rights of nature, the idea that nature itself has rights, like a river has rights. He's been working on this subject for more than a decade around the world. He's helped write laws on the subject throughout the Americas, and he's co-author of the first legal coursebook on the matter. Let's see what he has to say. Grant?
Hello, my name is Grant Wilson. I am the Executive Director of Earth Law Center, and we are a group of lawyers and advocates who fight for a new generation of Earth-centered or ecocentric laws that give nature a voice and rights in government, that defend future generations, and that otherwise evolve our legal system so that it is more protective and representative of nature. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the overlap between impact assessments and emerging cutting-edge movements, especially legal movements for the planet, and how those can shape the future of impact assessments. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you here. Okay, and so introduce myself. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do and what Earth Law is to start. Earth Law Center is a new generation of Earth lawyers, and we advocate for Earth Law. And so what is Earth Law, which I will talk all about today? Earth Law is often called ecocentric law, and it is an emerging body of law for protecting, restoring, and stabilizing the functional interdependency of Earth's life and life support systems. And that's kind of a fancy way of saying it's legal movements that would restore balance to our relationship with nature. And this is a book there on the left that we wrote about the topic that's being taught in law schools and undergraduate programs right now. So just to make it specific, some of the examples that comprise Earth Law are rights of nature, ecocide, animal rights, the rights of future generations, indigenizing the law, human environmental rights, atmospheric trust litigation, and guardianship of nature. And I'm going to tell you more about what some of these mean, especially the rights of nature. And then I'm going to connect it to impact assessments. First, I just want to introduce you to our team. Here we are. We've got a collection of lawyers and policy advocates. We're based in Canada, the U.S., Mexico, in Nigeria, all over the world. And we operate with our core team and then a large volunteer program. So if you're interested in our work and you want to volunteer or intern, please get in touch. And, why do we need these legal movements I'm going to tell you all about? Well, a fundamental premise of our work is that our legal system is broken for nature. And if you think about the legal system as the input and the health of the environment as the output, this is pretty clear. The output is drastically somber and worsening and in a state of crisis. And you've heard all these environmental statistics, so I won't get into them, but we have a simultaneous climate and biodiversity crises, in addition to a health crisis and many other crises that are impacting and changing the very face of our planet. And the environmental laws, the thousands of environmental laws we passed, have not worked to solve this crisis. And a growing number of leaders are arguing that we can't just work around the fringes here. We can't just make small adjustments and that's going to solve the problem. We need transformative change. And that's what a coalition of dozens of world leaders and heads of state came together and said in this Leaders Pledge for Nature. And I would argue that Earth law, and we're going to talk about what that is, the rights of nature, the rights of future generations, and so forth, is transformative change and would help be part of the solution to these environmental crises. But I want to step back and tell you a little bit about my interest in impact assessments. I was recently involved in presenting a case to a tribunal, and it's a citizens-led tribunal, so it's more of a moral or ethical one than a governmental one. But I was involved in presenting a case as to whether an onslaught of dams in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, constituted a violation of the rights of those ecosystems. Were those rights to be recognized, which they currently are not in Eastern Europe, and also to analyze whether that constitutes ecocide, which is a proposed crime that means basically destroying a whole ecosystem, and I'll give you the exact definition later. And so I was part of this group who presented to this tribunal on, what's going on in Eastern Europe and the Balkans with hundreds of small dams being installed all over this region, including in Serbia and beyond. And what are some of the reasons that this is being allowed to happen under their current legal system? So I just want to show you a few pictures of these small dams being installed in Serbia and Eastern Europe, quote unquote, small run-of-river hydro facilities. Which people say small, they're small, they're run-of-river, they don't have much of an impact, but in reality, they drain entire waterways of their water, they devastate freshwater ecosystems, they impair connectivity, they have all these horrible impacts. And, what was the role of environmental impact assessments in these dam processes? And I found out that one of the big challenges of many is that small hydropower, meaning less than 2 megawatts, is exempted for environmental impact assessment. So, I learned that these processes sometimes exempt certain activities entirely. I also learned that there wasn't a review of the cumulative impact of all of these small hydro facilities in the Balkans, not an adequate one anyway. And, you can think of a million examples where the environment is being degraded because of death by 1,000 cuts, and sometimes this slips through the impact assessment process. In this case, hundreds of small hydro facilities, many of which were exempted from review, cumulatively having major impacts on ecosystems. And then I learned that, the voice of nature, the voice of future generations, the voice of what you can call the voiceless, because these are people who don't engage in democracy and governance, normally was being left out of the process. And, I thought, what are some ways that we can fix this? I'm going to blast through some of the outcomes of that tribunal, but I encourage you to check it out online. It's the European Freshwater Rights of Nature Tribunal, and there's a case on the Balkans. You can learn all about it. So I gave you a little introduction into Earth law, and I told you a little bit about how I got interested in impact assessments, and it was in the context of these small dams being installed in the Balkans. So now I'm going to step back and tell you a little bit more about Earth law movements before I jump into recommendations of how impact assessments can look in the future. So the rights of nature is a big, big movement of earth law. It's the idea that nature has fundamental and inherent rights, just as humans do. The goal is to kind of challenge the status quo of less degradation as a policy goal. Many of our laws say, okay, we can keep exploiting nature, but let's do it a little less. And rights of nature says, well, maybe nature has a right to restoration. Let's restore it to health. And then, when you apply rights of nature, you have to think about, well, how does this work in practice? How does nature engage in government if it has rights? And you can give nature a voice through legal guardianship bodies. Just as a child or a disabled person might have a legal guardian, so too can nature that represents its rights and its interest in government. And this is a movement that's taking off all over the world. Here's a chart of rights of nature legal precedent 2021. Once it's all calculated this year, we'll be off the charts, literally, and show continued growth. And it's something that's established at some level of government in over 15 countries. Some countries say nature has rights nationally, such as in Ecuador and Bolivia and Uganda. Some countries say that. Other places have established statewide rights of nature, such as in various states in Mexico, like Oaxaca and Colima. And then in some places, it's been local governments where there's been an unwillingness to say nature has rights from the state or federal government. And you can guess the United States has not recognized rights of nature nationally. I hope one day they do. But a number, dozens, in fact, of local municipalities have said nature has rights within our local government. And then indigenous peoples as well have recognized nature has rights, and it's sort of in some cases, a rough translation of indigenous belief systems, because many peoples believe nature is alive and that humans have a responsibility to protect nature. And a rough translation of that in Western law can be that nature has rights. And just a couple examples to blast through is Ecuador's constitution says nature has rights to exist, persist, maintain itself, and regenerate. And now nature is in the courts fighting for these rights in a number of cases. It's won over a dozen cases, and there's currently a handful being considered by their constitutional court. But what hasn't happened in Ecuador, and this is getting back to the topic of this conference, is really applying the rights of nature in all the different corners of the legal system. And so rights of nature is not currently clearly applied in their impact assessment process, environmental impact assessments and so forth. So if there's a mining project or a dam project or a building project, it's not clear how rights of nature will be part of environmental review and impact assessments. But that's a room for growth. It's something we'll make some recommendations on in a little bit. In some countries, they've inferred the rights of nature based on existing rights, even where there's not legislation that says already that nature has rights. So, for example, in Colombia, there's been a series of landmark court decisions saying nature has rights because humans have environmental rights and local communities have biocultural rights, the right to engage in cultural practices as stewards of the environment. And in order to enforce all of those rights, we believe nature has rights as well, and that all these rights are interconnected, just like all life is interconnected on our planet. One of those cases was declaring the rights of the Colombian Amazon. I mentioned Mexico having statewide rights of nature, the United States having local rights of nature. Santa Monica is one place where they're working really hard to basically ratchet up their local environmental processes in enforcement of the rights of nature. And perhaps also interesting is we're working with a bunch of small mountain towns in the Rockies to pass rights of nature resolutions that are mostly declaratory but lead to something else, and that would lead towards legal guardianship of nature. And that's going to become really important to analyze for impact assessments, because legal guardianship is how nature could be involved in impact assessments once those structures are established. And then I mentioned indigenous-led movements. We've seen the Nez Perce tribe recognize the rights of the Snake River, with those rights being rights to exist, to flourish, to evolve, to flow, to regenerate, and to be restored. And they established an intention, the Nez Perce tribe did, to create legal guardianship bodies of the Snake River. If you don't know the Snake River, its salmon runs have been severely impaired to the point of near extinction because of a series of lower Snake River dams that really need to be removed urgently. And you can Google removal of the lower Snake River dams to learn more about that. The Yurok tribe has also recognized the rights of the Klamath River. And there's also been a little tease or interest in federal rights of nature. And the DNC has a climate emergency committee. It's called the DNC Council on the Environment and Climate Crisis. And they made a recommendation, which the DNC at large did not adopt, but they still made this important recommendation that the US establish a council on the rights of nature to explore incorporating these ideas into US law. So all of this, which is to say it's happening, the rights of nature is being looked at, it's being adopted, it's being talked about at all different levels of government. And if nature has rights, we're going to need to think about what that means for impact assessments, because all of a sudden it's a stakeholder in the process and something you have to consider. Internationally, there's been some support for the rights of nature as well, and within the UN, the IUCN, and the Convention on Biological Diversity, and there's all sorts of nuances and background here, but it's being talked about. Okay, so moving on to the next topic of Earth law. We talked about the rights of nature, legal guardianship for nature. Now, this can occur as a result of the rights of nature, but it's also its own legal area to study. Different countries have created bodies that serve as the legal human face and voice of nature. And unlike me, who, I like to speak for nature, you might like to speak for nature, these individuals have a legal and fiduciary duty, just like a guardian of a child, to speak on nature's behalf in its best interests and in defense of its rights. And so it's different than, an environmental group. One example, in Colombia, they have a legal guardianship body that speaks for the Atrato River. In New Zealand, the Wanganui Iwi, which is a Maori tribe, has a saying, "I am the river and the river is me." They believe themselves to be indistinguishable from the river. And so they naturally serve as a legal guardian of this river along with the Crown government. And there's plenty of examples. Of course, once you set up guardianship bodies, you have to answer the question, who speaks for nature? And that's a complicated question to answer. We do have some guidelines about that that I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested. Okay, moving on to the next Earth law movement, ecocide. And this is a movement to define ecocide as a crime. And there was recently a drafting committee that said what ecocide means. And they said it means an unlawful or wanton act committed with knowledge. So you have to have, know you're doing it. That results in a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment. So think of, those small hydro facilities that we talked about all over Serbia and the Balkans. I would argue those are an ecocide, and I did, because cumulatively it causes this major impact to freshwater ecosystems throughout the Balkans. And there's a policy, and there's different policies in Serbia and the EU, but different policies that encourage that behavior, and those contribute to an ecocide. Okay, moving on more quickly to another Earth law movement, animal rights. There's a growing number of governments that are considering or have recognized animals as having rights. And this is different than rights of nature because we're talking about an individual animal and not an entire ecosystem. A notable example, there is a bear living in Bogota who was granted a writ of habeas corpus and will be freed from captivity based on its rights. There's a group in the US called the Non-Human Rights Project that for years has been fighting for the rights of animals in courts, including in New York state courts. And it's gotten really close where the courts have basically said, well, animals are not just property. That's how we define them currently, but we're not sure if they're persons either. So what are they, ... to be continued. So another Earth law movement. We have the rights of future generations, the idea that people not born today have inherent rights that must be considered. And how do you represent those rights? It can, again, be through guardianship bodies, or in some places in Europe, they appoint what's called an ombudsman, a non-governmental or quasi-governmental person who defends the rights of a voiceless entity, future generations. And there's also been some exciting court precedents, such as in the Philippines, this case I have mentioned here, Opasa versus Factorin in 1993. There was a timber license agreement covering almost 4 million hectares of forest in a lawsuit over human environmental rights. And the court, in its ruling that successfully challenged this timber license, said not only do current generations of humans have rights, but future generations do as well. And like nature, future generations are voiceless. They don't have a voice, but how can we represent them in governmental processes anyway, including impact assessments? Right when I get through a few more Earth law topics, we'll discuss that a little bit. Another topic is indigenizing the law. Before Western legal systems, there were many indigenous belief systems and customs and what could be called legal systems as well. And, we dropped Western law over indigenous beliefs and customs like a ton of bricks. And in many cases, our Western laws don't really clearly translate to indigenous belief systems, but I think there's ways to bridge that gap. So, for example, we represent Lummi, which are indigenous people in Washington. We represent Lummi elders seeking the return of an orca who's in captivity named Scully Chuctanut, based on the notion that this orca is sacred to them. And there's a law called NAGPRA that basically demands the return of certain sacred items to Native Americans. And our clients are like, wait a minute, this orca, Scully Chuctanut, is sacred to us. And maybe the Western drafters of this law didn't recognize that when they drafted the law. But should we be interpreting our laws based on Western belief systems or indigenous belief systems when the people we're trying to protect are indigenous communities and peoples? And you can look at any number of laws, permitting laws, impact assessment laws, for example, and say, how would this law be interpreted under an indigenous worldview? And in many cases, it's different than how it would be interpreted under Western worldviews. So that's Earth Law in a nutshell. There's plenty of other topics. Check out our book. But getting back to Earth Law Center quickly, and then we're going to talk about Earth Law and impact assessments. What's Earth Law Center's role in all this? The organization I work with. How do we advance all these movements? Well, we create model Earth laws, and imagine if we created one about impact assessments and Earth Law and what the overlap is. I think that would be pretty cool. We engage in advocacy and strategic litigation. We try to create new laws and landmark court rulings establishing or promoting Earth Law. And we share our models and collaborate with partners worldwide to try to make this a global movement. And then, of course, we engage in education. I've talked a lot about that. We want our course book taught throughout the US. We work with interns and externs. We train judges and so forth. Contact me if you are interested. Okay, on to impact assessment. So I think all that background was necessary because it's different than what you might have normally learned in these sorts of conferences. And so hopefully you're already thinking about, oh, wait a minute, how can these things really influence the future of impact assessments? And I think I'm in the business of reforming the law. I think every area of the law can be reformed to consider nature, to consider ecocentrism. And we've been thinking about how IP law and how corporate law and so forth can incorporate these concepts. And I want everyone here to think about how impact assessments can incorporate these concepts as well. So again, my background isn't in impact assessments. I know a bit about them, use them a little bit, and I've just made some recommendations, some of which you might disagree with, some of which you might think are interesting. I consider this more of a brainstorm than my final product, but hopefully it encourages your thought process as well. So just looking at some different areas of impact assessments, what might they look like under an ecocentric law approach? And screening. Screening determines whether an impact assessment is required. And what if you had to do an impact assessment for any activity that has a reasonable likelihood of violating the rights of nature, or the rights of future generations, or any Earth law concept? And you could say maybe this is only required in governments to recognize these things, or maybe not. Scoping is the selection of information to include in the impact assessment. And I think an Earth law approach to scoping would say that you really need to look at the whole ecosystem, and That includes not only, if you're putting up a dam, not only the immediate downstream area, but the entire watershed. Or if you're going to be engaging in some deforestation, maybe you have to include an entire biosphere everywhere that relies upon this forest. Maybe you have to consider the climate and so forth. And so considering the whole ecosystem. I also think you could consider the impacts on future generations, on emphasize non-human communities, and really look at the entire web of life today and in generations to come. And then I know there's different types of impact assessments. There's human rights impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, health impact assessments. And what if you had some on a rights of nature impact assessment or an ecocide impact assessment and all sorts of different Earth law topics? And what if you integrated them all into one document? That's the Earth law perspective. And I think the people here today can figure out better than I can how to do that. And I hope you tell me and let's talk about it. Okay, foreseeable project impacts. You have to analyze all reasonably foreseeable impacts. Well, what if you looked not just this generation, but 7 generations ahead? You're looking at the impacts. And of course, what if you incorporated the precautionary principle into everything you did? If you're not sure what the impacts are, basically assume the worst until proven otherwise. Then impact assessments have available alternatives. And in looking at these alternatives, oftentimes there's none that are too significantly different from what the main project is, or nothing that's dramatically a totally different vision. And I would say, well, what if a few of those alternatives were transformative, cutting-edge alternatives, things that are totally different, like, hey, maybe we should never install another mega dam again, or maybe we shouldn't engage in deforestation projects unless it's net zero deforestation, and so forth. Let's at least have these things be part of the public conversation instead of telling the public that, the options here are from bad to worse. Let's look at something a little more inspiring. And of course, sometimes you need to just say no. And I think we need to say that more often. Last couple, mitigation measures. You have to identify mitigation measures so that translates the findings of the impact assessment into recommendations. And Earth law is all about stopping this trend of less declines, but declines nonetheless. Many environmental laws say, yeah, we're going to keep exploiting nature. We'll make the degradation slow down a little bit, but it's still happening. But what if, the mitigation measures focused on, we're going to do this project and nature's going to be restored. It's going to be better off than we left it. And I think that's the sort of philosophy we need incorporated into mitigation. And then monitoring and external controls, ensuring that companies or government do what they say they will. And I think we need monitoring, not just from civil society, not just from government, but also from nature and future generations. And that gets into who speaks for nature and how do you represent these people in these processes. And so, this is part of impact assessments, but also a little different. There's overlap, but what about stakeholder consultation and how can nature be part of that? Public participation is so important. We're going to talk about Principle 10 treaties, but public participation in impact assessment and review. What does the public mean? And, I've read stuff saying we need to really have a broad interpretation of what the public is. And what if they're so broad that the public included nature? It included all ecosystems, all species. It included the animals, the plants, the bees, the milkweed, the fish, the grizzly bears that are impacted. And it included future generations, both of humans and of nature. I think that is public. That's what the public is. And in fact, there's an interesting possibility right now where there's a new treaty in Latin America, the Escazú Agreement. It's a Principle 10 access rights treaty. So in other words, saying, people and the public should have access to environmental information, to public participation in environmental decision-making, and to justice. And what if that treaty was interpreted, especially in Latin American countries that recognize the rights of nature, which is so many these days? What if that was interpreted to include nature itself as part of the public? I think we need to make this change immediately. And then in consultations, when there's consultations, we need to consult the voiceless, whether it's through a guardianship body, an ombudsman, and so forth. And then when there's consultation in an culturally appropriate manner, we talked about indigenizing the law or interpreting the law based on indigenous beliefs. What if impact assessment? What if you looked at the whole thing from an Indigenous perspective? How would it be different? I don't want to speak too much about this because I'm not Indigenous, but I encourage that conversation to happen. It's very important. And then access to information. What would nature and future generations want to know that's different than what humans would want? And I think that's more of a focus on populations of species and the health of entire ecosystems and so forth. And this is my last slide. We can learn a little bit, I think. Okay, so let's say you think some of these things are a cool idea. Let's go for them. Yeah, let's consult nature. Let's consult future generations. Let's consider the impacts generations ahead. Let's make sure we close loopholes and consider the health of whole ecosystems because this is ecocentric. That's awesome. Let's do it. And maybe you get to the point where you go write a law or go to pass a law. And, I think we can learn from human rights impact assessment, which is also kind of on the cutting edge of impact assessments, as I understand it, and make sure that the stuff we do is ideally moving towards something really strong. And, I was just reviewing some human rights impact assessment legislation or policies, and in some places it's really weak. We encourage companies and NGOs to carry out, due diligence on human rights as appropriate to their size. On the one hand, this is good because it's a starting point. It's like, okay, you got to start somewhere, and we couldn't get the really strong law. But on the other hand, the climate and biodiversity crises and all the other crises are in a tailspin, and we have to do something urgently. And so we're going to do something stronger. I saw the Kenya example. I thought this is pretty strong. You require businesses to identify their human rights impacts. So require instead of encourage, that's stronger. Through conducting comprehensive, yes, that's big, that's holistic, incredible. Okay, so it's not junk science, human rights impact assessments before they commence. So yes, it's early on in the process. It's not at the last minute, and there's some other language there. Address and redress. We actually need to solve the issue, human rights violations. So when you're considering, the rights of nature, the rights of future generations, and so forth, enforcing those rights requires something strong, enforceable, something holistic and comprehensive. And I think we can learn from other impact assessments how that can all happen while not excluding the possibility that getting our foot in the door in some place is a good thing, even if it's not as strong as we want. So that's the end. I encourage you in your own professions, and again, I think many people here are experts in impact assessments, to think about how can we transform our processes, our laws, our requirements to consider the rights and needs of nature and other voiceless entities, to incorporate some of these other cutting edge legal movements like defining ecocide as a crime or the animal rights or even climate change litigation, and to really consider, how can we make this process something that's resulting in the restoration of nature or doing as much as it can to move towards that paradigm. So thank you so much. Check out our website, earthlawcenter.org, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye.
Thanks, Grant. That wraps the third of 6 sessions of the Think Big Virtual Forum. Next time, we'll see you on Friday, the 12th of November. In the meantime, drop by our online forum at thinkbig.iaia.org. You can leave your thoughts, ask some questions, join the virtual community. We'll see you next time.